The first thing I'm going to do is build a dimension, and that dimension is going to be this store dimension. So let's get started with that dimension. Solution Explorer has a folder for every type of object that we might build within our analysis services solution. So I'm going to start a dimension. I'll right-click on the dimension folder and click New Dimension. Of course, I have a wizard, which I don't really want to see again. The first page of the dimension wizard asks me what I want to use to build this dimension. I just want to use the table I already have, which is my store table. So I'll click Next here. I choose the data source view I want to use. I only have one data source view. I could have more than one, but in this case I only have one. And then tell it what main table I want. The first one in my list happens to be dim store. And then I can choose what is my key column, and that represents what's the primary key of a row in that table. Name column I'm going to leave as is for now. We're going to do a different lesson on keys and names. So for the moment I'm just going to leave that. I'll click Next. On this form, the wizard is noticing I have a couple of related tables, the CBSA for my statistical areas and my store manager table that I linked in with the foreign keys. So it wants to know if I want to bring in any of those attributes to include in this dimension as well. I'll go ahead and select those. And then on this page, I select the dimension attributes I want to include. The store key is fine. I also want to include the store name, and not to overwhelm you, I'm going to keep this very limited. I will bring in my statistical area names, and the store manager was pre-selected. Once I have the attributes that I want, I'll click Next. And then I give this a name. I'm just going to call this store. My users don't really know what dim means, so I think store's more friendly. Then I'll click Finish because I'm done. And the wizard has created a basic dimension. It's not very complex. There aren't that many relationships in here. There are no hierarchies, and certainly there's a lot of work I wanted to do with this yet, but it's good enough to get started. So I always like to develop and compile and build incrementally. So I'm just going to deploy this database to make sure it will deploy. And then I'm going to process this dimension. And process means read data in. So when I click on that, I can choose what kind of process I want. Full means essentially truncate the table, throw out all the data, and bring in all new data. That's what I want. There's actually no data yet. I just need to click Run. Now what's happening is the processing is occurring over on the server. This might be a remote machine. And as it's running, some feedback is being sent back to my window here so I can see what's actually happening. Each attribute you see is processed individually. So a corollary here is don't put more attributes in here than you need. The more attributes you add, the longer processing will take. So that's completed. And I can see how many rows were brought into each of these attributes. And we'll come back to the internals here in another lesson. And I'll close that. And I'm just going to go over to the database and point something out to you because I think it's lost on some people that this database has a dimension but not yet any cubes. And just the folder structure shows you that dimensions are top-level objects. So you can certainly have dimensions in a database before you create cubes. Those cubes will then use dimensions as part of their design, but the cubes don't own dimensions. Dimensions are owned by the database itself. Now we can actually browse this dimension at this point and see that there is data in here. So those are my CBSAs. If I want to see the list of store managers, oh, well, that's the key. If I want to see the list of store names, and oh, I do have manager name, so here are my managers. Okay, but that's not that interesting because there's no data associated. So let's do our second step and create a cube. Now a cube is a collection of measure groups, just as a database is a collection of cubes and dimensions and so on. But in order to create a measure group, we need a cube first. So we'll click New Cube. This wizard will actually create our first measure group and create our cube at the same time. Again, use existing tables, create an empty cube. We could create an empty cube and then manually add the measure groups, but we'll just go ahead and let it add our first measure group for us. I'll click Next. Now it doesn't really know which of these are my measure groups. That's for me to decide. And in fact, sometimes we'll have a table that is both a dimension and a measure group. So the wizard can never really make this decision on its own. It needs our help. Now on this screen, it really needs our help. What the wizard does is looks at the data type of every column in this table, and if it's numeric, then it assumes that's a measure. My advice, pick the ones you really need. It takes a lot less time to select what you really want than it does to delete all the things later that you didn't. I'll only choose a few here to keep it simple. On the next page, it wants to know which dimensions we want to include. We only have one, so we'll go ahead and leave that selected. And then a cube name, and this cube we'll call store sales. A cube generally will have some kind of a subject about it, so naming something like this normally makes it easier for users. As I click Finish, it will leave me on the Cube Designer, and there are a lot of tabs. We'll be going over all of these as we go, but for now, we can just see in our Measures window that we have our one measure group. So this is a measure icon with a little brackets around. I guess that means group. And that measure group contains measures. Over time, we may have additional measure groups that we'll get into, but for now, one is plenty to get started. And the second tab, I'll just kind of point out to you that measure groups run vertically here, and the dimensions that are associated with them run across, and the key that connects them is listed here. We'll spend a lot of time on this dialog later. But let's just make sure this works. I'll save my solution, deploy. Deploy successful. And then I'm going to right-click on the cube that I just built and process it. Again, I have various options we'll cover later. Process full just means read everything in and don't keep any of the data that's there now. Of course, there isn't any, so that's an easy task. And my process is completed. About 3.4 million rows were read in. And close. And again, just like I did with the dimension, I'll click the Browse tab here so I can actually check this out and see what I have. So if I drag over my measures, maybe widen them a little bit so I can see. You notice my formatting hasn't been applied yet. We'll do that later. And then I'll just drag over the store name. So those are my sales by store. And maybe bring in a statistical area. So we can see several stores within the Boston, Worcester, Manchester area and what their sales are. Later on, we'll build some hierarchies to make this look a lot better than it does right now. But that's just our basic steps for building a cube. So we already had our data source and data source view. Then we created our dimension. Then we created our cube. And that's really all we needed to do. If we double check that over in Management Studio and just refresh our view, we can see we now have a store dimension. We have a store sales cube, and it has one measure group with one partition. So it's a start, and that's really all there is to it.